Good? All right, let's keep it moving then. We're now in lesson 10. Did the New Testament writers tell the truth? This is part 2. The first part we covered early, eyewitness, embarrassing testimony. Now we're going to cover excruciating, expected, and extra-biblical testimony. Now, excruciating testimony is where we get the word excruciating, I should say. We get it from the cross. It means out of the crucifixion, out of the cross. And this is the argument that says that these individuals who were eyewitnesses and in a position to know what happened died excruciating deaths for saying that these things occurred when they could have saved themselves by saying otherwise or by denying it. In other words, they knew the situation and they knew that it would require their torture and maybe even their deaths, but they went ahead and said it happened anyway. In fact, this is a painting of Peter being crucified upside down. Tradition has it that they were about to crucify him, and he said, I'm not worthy to be crucified in the same manner of my Lord, so if you're going to crucify me upside down. Now, before we look at these martyrdoms, or before we talk a little bit more about them, let's take a look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection. Before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. After the resurrection, they said Christ's sacrifice is enough. It's sufficient. You know, the whole 2,000 or so years of animal sacrifice, they just said, don't need it anymore. Remember, the first Christians were Jews. They thought they had a relationship with the God of the universe. They thought they were God's chosen people, and here they are just saying, well, forget about that animal sacrifice thing we've been doing for so long. In fact, the animal sacrifice system pointed to the true sacrifice. They're sacrificing lambs, but then when the true Lamb of God came, he was the sacrifice that made all other sacrifices unnecessary. Before they believed in the binding law of Moses, afterwards Christ's life fulfilled that. Before they believed in strict monotheism, afterward they believed in a Trinity. Yes, I know the Trinity is hinted at in the Old Testament, but it's much clearer in the New. 3 persons in one divine essence. Before they believed in the Sabbath, in fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterwards, they believed Sunday worship. Now, some Christians even believe you should obey the Sabbath now, but most say no. And in fact, most, after the resurrection, didn't adhere to it anymore. In fact, Paul even talks about this in Colossians. He says, don't let anyone tell you have to worship on a certain Sabbath day or keep a certain Sabbath day. Jesus fulfilled all that for us. Before they believed in a conquering Messiah, afterwards a sacrificial Messiah. Before they believed in circumcision, afterwards they believed in baptism and communion. Now again, I remind you that the first Christians were Jews. The only writer of the New Testament that was not a Jew was Luke. Everybody else is a Jew. What would have caused these pious Jews to abandon virtually everything on the left for everything on the right virtually overnight? About the only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is some event that occurs in your life that is so impactful that it can cause you to alter your direction 180 degrees. And some impact events are so dramatic that they will cause you to remember everything about the event till the day you die. You might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, but you will remember an impact event 50 years ago if you're that old. In fact, let me give you an example of this. Only a few people in this room will be able to answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How many people in here can remember what you were doing November 22nd, 1963? Raise your hands, please. Everyone who can remember that, please raise your hand high. The rest of you, look around the room for a second. You see the people with their hands up? These people are very old. Okay. What happened November 22nd, 1963? President Kennedy was assassinated. It's my earliest memory. I was 2 years old and 2 days. In fact, I just turned 50 last November. I was 2 years old and 2 days. And I remember standing in the living room, and my mother was sitting on an ottoman in the living room in front of the TV, weeping uncontrollably. I can still see her right now in my mind. I said, Mommy, what's the matter? What's the matter? She said, they killed the president. She had tissues all. They killed the president. I can still see her in my mind right now, and that was over 48 years ago. I can see her when she was 25 years old. She's 74 years old right now. I just saw her this morning. She lives here in Fort Mill. But I can remember that. Now, some of you can remember that clearly as well. It's just an impact event. You'll never forget where you were and what you were doing. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? Can you remember where you were and what you were doing? I was on the phone with a pastor up in Huntersville, and I had my back to the TV. I had it on, but I'd seen that the first tower was hit, and I was talking to this guy, and I'm saying, hey, you got the TV on? He goes, yeah, something's going on up there in New York. I said, yeah, I don't know what happened. Maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower. What was it? We didn't know. And suddenly he yells into the phone. He goes, whoa! And I turn around. The second tower is on fire. He said, another plane just went into the second tower. I said, you just saw that? He goes, yeah. I go, what kind of plane was it? He says, it was a big plane, like a United plane. It was a passenger plane. It wasn't a little Cessna. I go, really? He goes, yeah, I just saw it. I said, I'll call you back. I hung up the phone. I looked at the TV, and for some reason that day I had CNN on. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN said this: one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. I said, navigational error? You dimwit. This is certainly not navigational error. This is the clearest day in the history of New York City. 2 passenger planes go into the World Trade Towers. This is called terrorism. Wake up. I got on the phone the next day to that pastor. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam, because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was over 10 and a half years ago, or almost 10 and a half years ago. I think it's over 10 and a half years ago now. But if I asked you where you were, say, the 11th of last month, there's not a person in here that could tell me. Why? Because there's no impact event that day. But you can remember something almost 11 years ago now. Why? Impact event. Do you think that if Jesus really rose from the dead, that would have been an impact event? Do you think that the disciples would have remembered everything Jesus did and everything Jesus said, and they would have remembered everything they said and everything they did until the day they died? Do you think there'd be any question? They'd have any trouble remembering what happened? No, the impact event would have indelibly imprinted it on their minds. In fact, that's the only way I can see why they would have abandoned everything on the left for everything on the right. An impact event. In fact, here's a good question to ask people. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain by making up the resurrection account and abandoning Judaism, or saying Judaism had finally been fulfilled? What did they have to get? What did they get temporally? Well, they got excommunicated from the synagogue. Then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. We're going to start a new religion. We are? Yeah. What's it going to get us? It's going to get us beaten, tortured, and killed. Oh, before that, excommunicated. Well, sign me up. Why haven't we thought of this earlier? No, you wouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. You know, I get a lot of questions from people, and maybe you do too. Some people will say, well, are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles in early Christianity? Well, actually there is. We'll get to them here in a few minutes. But you know what? The thought behind the question is that these people who wrote this down can't be trusted because they're religious people. Whereas the secular folks out there, or the folks who are not Christians, you can trust them because they didn't have any bias. That's kind of the thought behind the question. I think the exact opposite is true. Why? Because the people that wrote this down had everything to lose by saying it did happen. And yet they went ahead and said it did happen. The non-Christian writers, who we'll see here in a few minutes, mention Jesus and the apostles briefly here and there. They didn't, first of all, they weren't eyewitnesses. And they didn't have any bias either way, really. These people, however, had a bias not to write it down, not a bias to write it down, because by writing it down, they got excommunicated, beaten, tortured, and killed. They had no motive to write it down. They had every motive to stay away from it, to run away from it, but they didn't. In fact, Why would they die for a known lie? That doesn't make any sense. You say, wait, Frank. If you're saying that martyrdom proves Christianity, we've got a problem. Because there are martyrs in other religions, particularly Islam. They have martyrs, but you wouldn't believe Islam was true, certainly not with regard to Jesus, because Surah 4, 157, that's the 4th chapter in the Quran, verse 157, says Jesus never even died. He was taken straight to heaven. Somebody was substituted for Jesus, is the theory there. But the New Testament documents say not only did Jesus die, he rose from the dead. They both can't be true about that particular point. Yet they both have martyrs. So how do we resolve this? Well, there's a number of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. A number of differences, but the one significant one for our purposes is the fact that the New Testament martyrs were eyewitnesses. They saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus. They knew with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. You can't get better evidence than that. But the Muslim martyrs of today, they don't have any evidence that they're going to get the 72 virgins or whatever if they fly a plane into a building. They just have faith. You see, many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went ahead with it anyway. Which, of course, is great comfort for us many years later, saying they must have really believed it, and they seem to have good evidence it was true. So that excruciating testimony, I think, is good evidence that what they're saying here is true. How about expected testimony? What's that all about? This deals with Old Testament prophecy. In fact, through reason and science, we know that God exists and created us for a purpose. We went through that when we went through points 1, 2, 3 about does truth exist, does God exist, are miracles possible? So we have good evidence that there's a theistic God exists, that a theistic God exists. Since the Old Testament teaches the same, it could be reliable. In other words, maybe, given this information, we ought to look at the Old Testament and see what it says about maybe a coming Messiah. And when you look at a coming Messiah, the Old Testament predicts one. In fact, this is in the book, by the way, this graphic. There's a descending order of prophecies that result in the bullseye, the target of the prophecies being Jesus. It starts, the first prophecy in the Bible begins in Genesis 3:15, where it says the Messiah, or the offspring of Eve, will come from the seed of a woman. You say, well, what's so important about that? Everybody else is born from the seed of a man. The Messiah comes from the seed of the woman. And in that passage, it says that the offspring of Eve will crush the offspring of the head of the serpent. And this was done beautifully if you saw the movie The Passion. You guys see the movie The Passion? It's like the opening scene. Jesus is in great distress in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's a Satan figure who lets a serpent, a snake, come out from under her or him, whatever it was. And as Jesus is in agony on the ground, the snake slithers over him, and he finally stands up, and suddenly you just hear a great thump because he crushes the head of the snake. And at that point, you see the guards coming. Now, everyone in the theater, if you saw it in the theater, when the thump came, in our theater, everyone jumped because we weren't expecting it. Well, what did that signify? It signified Jesus had decided to go through with the sacrifice. And as soon as he decided to go through with it, when he symbolically crushed the head of Satan, he crushed Satan and set the world free from sin. And then you see the guards coming. That's the very first prophecy in the Bible. There's several other prophecies. It also says that the Messiah would come from the line of David. It says it twice in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23:5 and then Jeremiah 33:15. It says this Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Micah 5:2. It says this Messiah would be both God and man. Isaiah 9:6. That this Messiah would actually be Almighty God. This child would be God. It says that this Messiah would visit the temple in Malachi 3:1. The Lord you seek will suddenly come to the temple. Now, if the Old Testament's true, particularly this prophecy, the Messiah had to come prior to 70 AD. Why? Temple's gone. It's been gone. Also, the Messiah would die in 33 AD. This is a relatively complicated prophecy that Harold Hoehner Dallas Theological Seminary did his dissertation on, but he looked at the weeks in Daniel and came up with 33 AD. Very interesting prophecy. And finally, that this prophecy would also be a sacrifice. Isaiah chapter 53. In fact, in my view, you could wipe out every prophecy above Isaiah 53 and still have good evidence that we should expect a Messiah from the Old Testament. Why? If there's one prophecy I would hang my hat on, it would be Isaiah 53. What is Isaiah 53? If you've never read it, go home and read it tonight. In fact, start in chapter 52, verse 11 or 13, and go to the end of Isaiah 53. When you read that, you will see that is an uncanny description of the sacrificial death and atonement that Christ accomplished for us, written 700 years in advance. You say, well, how do we even know it was written in advance? Because Isaiah, the scroll of Isaiah, the greatest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is called the Great Scroll of Isaiah, and here it is. It's a full 24 feet long, completely or virtually completely intact. We know that this particular scroll is dated to be at least from about 100 BC or earlier. So that scroll right there, and by the way, this is the relevant section of Isaiah 53. Look at how good a shape that scroll is for being over 2,000 years old. This particular scroll, again, at least 100 BC, written at least 130 years prior to Jesus, and it's got all of Isaiah 53 in it. Now, of course, the whole book of Isaiah was written sometime several hundred years earlier, but this scroll has been verified to be prior to the birth of Christ. So we know beyond any reasonable doubt this prophecy predates Christ. And by the way, if you ever get to Jerusalem, go to the Shrine of the Book Museum, you'll see this scroll. It's in there, the greatest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, if I had nothing else to go on, I would just use Isaiah 53. It even says in Isaiah 53 that he will die and see the light of life. Seems to imply the resurrection there. It's an amazing prophecy. You've got to read the thing. In fact, we printed it in our book in chapter 13. In fact, a very interesting occurrence occurred with Isaiah chapter 53. We have a professor at our seminary, Barry Leventhal, who in 1966 was a member of the UCLA Rose Bowl team. And they were not predicted to do very well that year, and they happened to win the Rose Bowl. And he was a co-captain. He's one of the offensive linemen. He was a Jewish kid. But Hal Lindsey was the Campus Crusade director on the UCLA campus at the time. Now, I don't know if you know who Hal Lindsey is. He's written several books, one of them called The Late Great Planet Earth, which brought a lot of people to Christ, even though the book turned out to be wrong prophetically. But in any event, Hal Lindsey was going after Barry, witnessing to him on campus, and he said to Barry, what about these Old Testament prophecies? They're right here in the Old Testament. And Barry said, they're not in the Old Testament. You've got a trick Bible there to fool the Jews. Hal said, I don't have a trick Bible. What are you talking about? He said, yeah, you put those in there to fool the Jews. He said, Barry, they're in your own Tanakh. Do you have a Tanakh? That's a Jewish Old Testament. He goes, yeah, I got one. I got one at my bar mitzvah. I haven't looked at it in a while. Hal said, well, go home and look at it. Here are the verses. Take them home and go see if they're in your Tanakh. He said, okay, I'll do it, but don't call me. I'll call you. He said about a week later, he started feeling guilty because he hadn't checked the verses out. And he said, well, I better look at them. They're not in there anyway. So he pulled his Tanakh off the shelf. He started looking up the verses, and he immediately said, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Intellectually, he knew at that point Jesus was the Messiah because they were in there. But volitionally, he wasn't there yet. The first thing he thought about when he knew intellectually Jesus was the Messiah, what are my parents going to say? What's my Jewish fraternity going to say? What's my rabbi going to say? I can't become a Christian. So actually what he did is he went to his rabbi. And this is, by the way, this is all in chapter 13 of the book. He goes to his rabbi. And he says, Rabbi, I got some Christians on campus who are saying Isaiah 53 is about Jesus. Who do you think it's about? So the rabbi reads Isaiah chapter 53, and he says, well, I'll tell you the truth, Barry, this does seem to be about Jesus, but since we Jews don't believe in Jesus, it can't be about Jesus. And Barry said, I didn't know much about logic at that point, but that logic just didn't sound kosher to me. Several weeks later, he kneeled beside his bed and gave his life to Christ. Now he is actually a pastor, or I should say a professor at our seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary right here in Charlotte, where I attended. And it's a great school for apologetics. All right, lastly, and this will take just a couple of minutes, extra biblical testimony. We've got early, eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expectant, and extra biblical testimony. What is extra biblical testimony? This is the testimony that says that there are other writers outside the New Testament that mention Jesus and the apostles briefly. And who are these people? Household names. In fact, there are 10 of them. 10 ancient non-Christian sources. People like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon, Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. People that we've all probably read earlier today in our devotions, right? Most of us haven't heard of any of these names, but yes, these people actually did exist. They were historians at the time. And when you piece together their references, and they just briefly mention Jesus and the apostles and Christianity, they're not eyewitnesses, but they obviously are getting their information somewhere. When you take their very brief references to Jesus and early Christianity, here is the storyline you get, just from their references. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. By the way, they're not saying they believed he rose from the dead. They're saying his disciples believed he rose from the dead. But that's still pretty important that these folks knew the disciples believed he rose from the dead. And his disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. Now, when you read this, notice that this is exactly what the New Testament says. That when you piece together all these so-called secular, non-Christian references to Jesus and early Christianity, you get a story that is perfectly congruent with what the New Testament documents say. Again, let me reiterate, though. If I'm going to base my belief on anything, it's not going to be on what the non-Christian writers say. That's just icing on the cake. It's going to be on what the people who had everything to lose by saying it was true said. And here's what they said. They had no motive to make this up, every motive to say it didn't happen. So what's the summary? We have early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expectant, and extra biblical testimony. There are 4 more reasons in the book that you can get if you want to see more of this. The conclusion here is the New Testament's historically reliable. It's fact, not fiction. If it says Jesus said it, Jesus really said it. If it says Jesus did it, then Jesus really did it. Now, when we come back, we're going to say, okay, well, what books should be in the Bible, though? How do we even know that the books that we have here are the ones that should be in the Bible? That's what we're going to look at, and we're going to get into what you may have heard people say, well, what about the Da Vinci Code novels? You know, Da Vinci Code said there were a lot of novels, gospels. There's other gospels out there. Why shouldn't they be in the Bible? So what we have here now are historically reliable documents that they tell us basically what happened about 2,000 years ago. At this point, we're not saying the documents are inerrant. We're not arguing in a circle here. We're simply saying we have historically reliable documents. Inerrancy is a conclusion we come to later. But right now, we're just saying, look, it looks like Jesus really did die and rise from the dead. Hey, by the way, if that's true, Christianity's true. That's it right there. That's the central fact in Christianity. Other than there is a God and you are not him, the other fact is Jesus was God, died, and rose again, and pays for your sins.